Thank you, Ed. Thank you all for being here. That was an amazing talk, the one before, and it was about virtual reality. So I'm going to yank you back to earth, to the reality of a moderate talk, essentially. And today I'm going to talk about color and light. And that's because manipulating color and light is at the heart of our daily experiences. From drawing a curtain to swiping your smartphone, you're essentially manipulating color at some level. And in fact, for the longest time in human history, people have tried to represent both their imagination as well as the natural world around them through color, through the familiar form of paintings. Right? So this is an example of an amazing painting. It's obviously done by an expert artist, an artist who knows how to apply pigments in perfect harmony. And isn't this amazing, this painting? I can look at this painting and I can imagine standing up on the bridge. I can imagine looking down at the lilies. I can even imagine that there's a reflection of the bridge in the water, and actually there is in the painting out here. And what's remarkable about this painting is that it's normally hung in a museum. And you and I would walk to the museum and you'd actually see the ambient light reflect off the canvas into your eye. That's how you perceive the painting, and through that perception, you can actually imagine all these wonderful things about the painting. Let's go back a few years, 1,500 years, and let's look at another painting. This is a cave painting in the ancient caves of Ajanta in India. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this painting is the Buddha holding a lotus flower. You can see a lot of detail in this painting. You can actually see the necklace around Buddha's neck in this particular painting. And if you are fortunate enough to go and see this in person, you'll actually see a faint glow, or you'll perceive the glow of the necklace. And what's remarkable about this painting, unlike the previous one, is that it's in a dark cave. There isn't a lot of ambient light in this cave. And yet, the human eye is so good at perceiving all the details in a fairly faintly lit cave of this amazing painting. Right? So for the longest time in human history, paintings were one way that we represented our natural world and imagination in color. There was a problem with paintings, though. Paintings are static images. They don't move. So if you wanted to see something move, if you wanted to watch a play, you had to go in person, essentially. And that changed with the advent of television. Right? You had these big boxes of cathode ray tubes. That was your first black and white television. And that was a huge technological leap from where we were before that. And then there was another big technological leap, which was the color cathode ray television screens. And now you have flat screen TVs everywhere, including in your pocket. You were reminded to turn them off today. That we are addicted to them. We are absolutely addicted to these screens. In fact, it isn't ludicrous for us to think that this is not what we say to us every day. I'll let you digest that for a second. So, first of all, let me thank you for coming here in person. Because when you've come here in person to watch some of us speak, you're actually looking at us in reflection. The light in this auditorium is reflecting off me, and you're perceiving me in reflective mode. And that's exactly how you perceive the paintings of Monet and the ancient painting in the caves at Ajanta. But that's not the way you perceive your screens or your television. Those are throwing light at you. Right? So there is a difference in the way we perceive our screens as opposed to how we perceive each other and the paintings. And so you're wondering, how did that come about? In fact, if you take your smartphone and you strip off the front part of your screen, the backlighting on your smartphone is as bright as a car headlight. That's pretty bright. So how have we accepted a screen that actually throws light at you? In fact, if you had a screen that was reflective and vivid and bright and could display dynamic information, something like this, you'd love to take it out in bright sunshine and look at it. You'd probably see the static content, the text, as well as the dynamic movie playing in bright sunlight, which you can't do currently with your screens. So why is it that we have to sit in a dark room to enjoy a movie with all its colors? Well, the reason is pretty simple. We don't have a technology that can create displays in reflective mode that is fast enough for us to be able to watch movies. Right. So I'm a nanoscale engineer, and my colleagues are nano engineers as well. And we said, could we frame this problem in a way that we can solve using nanoengineering? And that's where we started, and we started looking for examples around us in ways in which color is created naturally, and for ways in which we can manipulate this color so that we can create movable images. And so there are lots of examples in nature, and one example is this beautiful European peacock butterfly. And you can see there are a lot of colors on the wings of this butterfly, and all these colors are created by a property called the interference of light. So the peacock's wings has a lot of very, very thin films, and they interfere light in such a way that some colors are magnified and some are not. And using this, it can create a fairly substantial and bright color palette on the wings. And we said, what if we could use interference to create color, and what if there was a way to change this interference on the fly so we can change the color, essentially? So before we go into this, let me just take 2 slides to explain what interference means. So let's take something that's familiar to all of us, a soap bubble floating around in air. The soap bubble has 2 surfaces, the inner surface and the outer surface. And so let's take a section of the soap bubble, outer surface, inner surface. A ray of light strikes it. One ray of light reflects off the top surface, the other off the inner surface. Right? Now, some of the rays will arrive at the same time at this point. And when they arrive here, let's say a light is made up of waves. They have peaks and valleys. And if the 2 rays of light arrive here such that the valleys and the peaks are lined up, they would add, and you would just get a brighter image. But if they were to arrive such that they are not lined up and they perfectly cancel each other out, you'd get a dark reflection. Now, obviously, color is made up of a lot of wavelengths of light, and wavelength is essentially the distance between 2 peaks. And so you can imagine that each color would interfere destructively, i.e. they would cancel each other out or add each other up in different ways, which is why you see all the colors of a rainbow on a bubble as it's wafting through the room. And what also happens is, as the bubble is moving around in the air, the water evaporates and the thickness of the bubble reduces, which changes how light interferes, which contributes to the familiar shimmer that you see as the bubble floats around, until, of course, the bubble bursts eventually. And so that gives you a clue as to how to make something more dynamic. How do you make a color dynamic? You can do that by changing the interference. Right? Now, my colleagues and I had no interest in bursting any bubbles, proverbial or otherwise. So we looked to another property of materials, and this property is called refractive index. Don't panic, it's fairly simple, and all of you have observed this at some point, the familiar spoon in the water cup experiment, which you probably have tried informally or formally, where the spoon appears bent as it goes through the water. Right? And that's because light bends at the interface between air and water, which makes you think that the spoon is actually bent. And so we said, if light bends, let's say we take a block of material here, light bends as it goes through this material a certain way. What if we could flick the material's refractive index instantaneously? Would it change how the light bends as it goes through the material? It would. And so if you could do this, could you change interferences by designing our thin films cleverly. And we said, okay, so are there any materials that can do this? Could you apply, let's say, a current for simplicity and change its refractive index? It turns out there are a lot of materials that do it. And we call them phase change materials. And they're amazing materials. They basically go between two solid phases, so you won't see a difference in the solidity of the material. And they go between a state where all the atoms are nicely lined up to a state where they're scrambled, essentially. And these two states have completely different refractive index. Light bends differently through them. And using this material and designing simple thin film stacks exactly like on the butterfly's wings, we can create displays. And we've done exactly that, and we've actually created displays with exceptional resolution using something like that. So this is a section of pixels that you would see if you took your smartphone and looked at it under a microscope, right? And each of these pixels consists of blue, red, and green subpixels. So typically, this is about the width of a human hair, which is about 70 micrometers. We've managed to create entire images within the size of a single pixel within your phone. And we were having so much fun, we created a lot more images. For example, we created all these familiar images, all at the resolution that is remarkable. So our pixels are about 100 nanometers, where a nanometer is about a billionth of a meter. So our pixels are really, really small. And you would ask, why would you need such resolution? Well, we had 2 talks that spoke about virtual reality. And in virtual reality, you actually magnify pixels out. You take a small pixel, you magnify it such that it appears larger than it really is. So you need really high resolution in order to make sure that your image doesn't appear pixelated as you go into virtual reality paradigms. And also in future, who knows, we might be able to create moving hologram. And for these, you need really high resolution that you can actually project out there. And I started out with art, and we thought, okay, well, we could be artists too, copy artists, but we could be artists too. So we tried to do something cool with it, essentially. And so we recreated this diptych of this fairly famous person, and I'm not sure if TED audiences know who this person is. I'm sorry I didn't pick Einstein here. But essentially, each of these colored images here represent an optical image, something that you can see with your eye. And the black and white images here are all the electrical conductivity maps. And what we wanted to show was, indeed, you could apply current and change how the optical effect changes, which is what essentially a dynamic display is using this technology. Now, each of these images, again, is about the width of a human hair. So the resolution we have is very, very high. So one of the things we're really interested in is, okay, how can you go from really high resolution to really poor resolution, which is essentially really large areas that you can change the color of? What applications could they have? And let's say you have a car, right? And it's a fancy car, and you like it a lot, and you want to change the color of the car. Can you flick a switch and change the color of the car using exactly the same effect? And if you could, wouldn't that be cool, essentially? Now, I have no idea what that would be useful for. But I never thought I needed a smartphone until I found that everyone around me was using one. So you never know where applications can come from, essentially, for technologies such as this. And why this is possible using our technology is that we can actually create really lustrous color on flexible substrates. So I have a few flexible substrates with me here. And you can create a lot of very lustrous color, which doesn't look faded out at all in reflective mode. So there is a possibility that this could happen with technology that uses thin film interference. And what's really nice about thin film interference is that unlike pigments, they don't fade. It's just an optical effect. So they'll maintain their color for a very long time indeed. Well, that's enough about the visible color. The visible color is really a small part of what we call light, right, essentially. So let's take sunlight, for example. If you take sunlight, the visible spectrum of colors visible to us in sunlight is pretty small, right? In fact, if you have sunlight streaming into a room through a window, 50% of the heating in the room is because of light which is outside of this visible spectrum in the infrared, which ends up heating the room. What if you could flick a switch that just shuts off the infrared radiation? You wouldn't notice any difference because your human eye cannot see the infrared, and so the room will still appear nice and bright with a lot of natural light streaming in, but you might end up cooling the room down quite substantially. And if you could flick it back and forth, you could do some sort of smart cooling within your window while still enjoying the benefit of natural light. And these are the kind of technologies we are trying to move this thin film interference effect into as we go forward. So I'd like to end by saying thank you again for coming to watch me in person. The lights are reflecting off of me, so you're watching me in reflecting mode. And I love watching you all in reflective mode. It's a much better experience. Let's hope that our technology catches up with our reality. Let's anticipate that it does indeed catch up in the next few years. Thank you very much.